afternoon, folks. Good afternoon. Good afternoon, and welcome to Nothing New Under the Sun, also known as Black Church History 101.
Yes, sir.
201, 301, and 401. We're going to cover a lot of ground in here. It's my pleasure to introduce both Dr. Alicia Jackson and some guy named Dr. Carl Ellis. I heard he's cute, so slip him my number.
You got a mother.
Let me tell you about these two. Dr. Jackson is someone I have followed and admired for a very long time. I finally got to meet her today after 8 years of orbiting each other. And great respect for her. She is the Associate Professor of History here at Covenant College. She's been here for 14 years? 15 years. 15 years. Doing the hard work of informing the rest of the body what we've done and what the nations have done, not just what happened in Western church history. Her research area is in particular the CME. And Dr. Jackson is highly published, so it's an honor for me to sit here today, as I'm sure it's an honor for you. Now, this fellow, Carl Ellis, this joker. I could tell you all his degrees and all the places he's been and all the places he's taught and all the people he's discipled over many, many years, many, many decades. But I think the greatest thing about him is he loves Jesus. Amen. And he loves the church. Amen. He is a churchman through and through. And you guys are probably already familiar with his work. I think probably the greatest thing about Carl's work is his faithfulness over the years. He's a model in faithfulness. So it's my honor to just become small now and let these two greats teach us. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon. Am I holding this up? Okay, all right. Such a privilege to be here and to be able to talk about history. I mean, this is my love. And my husband can tell you a lot about this. Even my children can tell you about it. When we go on vacation, it's research trips are a part of our vacation. So anyway, go to museums, that's a part of our vacation. So anyway, so my work primarily focuses in on the CME church, but I look at the Black church in a larger context, particularly following emancipation. And so the area that I focus in on and that my work focuses in on is on the Reconstruction period. There we go. All right, so the Reconstruction period, of course, we're talking about the period immediately following emancipation. And it is a period where there's a lot of hope that African Americans will be able to fully embrace what it means to be free. And they'll be able to vote. They'll be able to decide where they want to live, what kind of work they want to do, the way their family will be structured, whether their wives will go out and work. And it's an amazing period because think about this. This is the first time a couple can get together and decide how their household will run because they didn't have that in slavery. They couldn't determine where their children would go. They couldn't determine a lot of things. So there was so much hope with the Reconstruction period. And if you've seen Henry Louis Gates' series, I would recommend watching it. It gives a great overview of the period. So there's a lot of hope and opportunity. But one of the things that you're going to see happen that as a part of Reconstruction period is that there's a huge backlash as people of color are trying to embrace what it means to be free. And it's a remarkable period because if you think about Reconstruction period, we're talking roughly like 1865 to 1877. There are 3 amendments to the Constitution that are passed. And can anybody tell me what they are? The 13th? And what? The 15th Amendment, and then there's the 14th Amendment, which gives citizenship and the whole idea of due process of law. I mean, these amendments to the Constitution were very, very important and still very much important, and very much contentious discussion and debate about these amendments, but particularly the 14th Amendment in terms of citizenship. But anyway, with Reconstruction period, you're going to see a number of challenges. And so the work that I do, this is a part of my book, that project, is I look at Georgia in particular. And a lot of times when we think about sort of southern states where you see massive oppression, a lot of times, typically we'll think of states like Mississippi or Alabama. Believe it or not, Georgia is worse during this period. It's so bad that black individuals leave Georgia to go to Mississippi, and they go to Arkansas. Now, at this point, Mississippi is not as bad. There's certain parts of it is not as bad as other parts, so particularly North Mississippi around Holly Springs area. Probably the person you're most familiar with who is from Holly Springs is Ida B. Wells. But Holly Springs is a important location. Roy Wilkins' family, who of course is very important to the civil rights movement, his family originates in that Holly Springs area. So it's a area that percolates with a very strong black community. So that's probably the reason why black individuals would move there, and then there's some economic opportunity there. But either way, the Reconstruction period in Georgia, one of the things that you see happen is that you have a number of black legislators who are elected to serve in the Georgia Assembly. But in September of 1868, they are expelled from the Georgia Assembly. They are kicked out of the Assembly because of the fact that they're black legislators. And what this will mark is Georgia being under Reconstruction 3 times. Which is very distinctive for a southern state to have this happen. I mean, again, the conditions are such where the federal government would have to come in 3 times and try to put Georgia back on the right path. And so one of the things that you see happen that's a part of this is that you see the black church becoming very actively involved, in particular the Methodists. One of the things that's distinctive, and this is part of my work, is looking at how the Methodist church in Georgia, particularly the black Methodists, are very, very powerful individuals and very, very powerful in giving voice to the concerns in the black community. Most notably, you have Tunis Campbell Sr., who represents the AME Zion. Of course, they hail from the Northeast New York area, and they're formed in the late 1700s. And then, of course, Henry McNeil Turner represents the AME Church, which is formed in Philadelphia and dates into the late 1700s as well. And so both of these men are serving in the Georgia legislature. They're very outspoken about the conditions that black people are experiencing in Georgia. And so they're going to be a part of those 33 legislators that are expelled from the Georgia legislature. And they go to the federal government and they say, you've got to do something because this is going on. There are other atrocities that are going on that I won't spend a lot of time talking about. But eventually what happens is that you're going to have the federal government come in, put Georgia under Reconstruction again, and they expel Confederate sympathizers. There were a number of Confederate sympathizers who were in the Georgia legislature who were expelled in January of 1870, allowing for essentially one of the main things that they do when those Confederate sympathizers are kicked out is it allows for Georgia to ratify the 15th Amendment. Now, it would be essential for Georgia to participate in this process because, of course, and you probably know this, but Congress can pass amendments to the Constitution, but 2/3 of the states have to ratify it before it becomes an amendment to the Constitution. So it was critical for Georgia to ratify this amendment so that the 15th Amendment would become an amendment to the Constitution. So you have again, these individuals, these Confederates expelled. Georgia ratifies the 15th Amendment. You also have black individuals, the Turner in particular, Campbell as well, are able to reclaim their seats and serve in the Georgia legislature. Now, my work sort of hinges upon an individual named Isaac Anderson, who is a CME. Typically, the history of the CME Church has been that the CME Church acquiesced that they were not politically involved. But the man I focus in on, Isaac Anderson, was a CME, was a founder of the CME Church, and he is very much politically involved. And so one of the things that he does is, as he's helping to organize the CME Church in Central Georgia, he also ends up running and winning election to the Georgia legislature. So he's simultaneously, again, organizing this, this new denomination, which would be the CME Church, and he is also galvanizing support for his run for office, which is very significant because of the fact that in 1870, when he runs and wins election, the rest of the state becomes Democratic. So in this one little pocket of Central Georgia, you have a Republican ticket sweeps in the heart of the Black Belt of Georgia. They sweep while the rest of the state votes Democrat. Okay, and we're talking about a time when Democratic Party is associated with the KKK, and the Republican Party, I want to make sure we clarify that, and the Republican Party is associated with, look at the party of Lincoln. And the CME, thank you. Yeah, we work together as a team here, my husband. Anyway, the CME stands for the Colored Methodist Episcopal Church. And in the 1950s, they became the Christian Methodist Episcopal Church. But the CMEs, and one of the things that's interesting about them and why people say they acquiesced to white leadership is because the CMEs were started by the Southern Methodists. And the Southern Methodists were very concerned about the AME and the AME Zion coming in and radicalizing the Black population in the South, which were in large numbers joining the AME and AME Zion Church. Anderson, though, is a very interesting story because of the fact that he is political. And even though the Southern Methodists don't want the CMEs to be political, he is, okay? And so, again, he wins election, and he becomes one of the last Black Republicans in the Georgia legislature, Senate. He runs for a Senate seat and wins in 1870. And so he, along with one other Black man, would serve in the Georgia legislature, and their terms would end in 1870. They would be the last Black senators, state senators in Georgia. It wouldn't be until 1964, I think, when you have another Black senator, state senator elected. So it's very significant. And how this all connects with talking about the Black church, and here's a picture of Isaac Anderson there, is that the Black church was so important because it served, first and foremost, and this is one of the things I argue a lot in my book, but it serves first and foremost as a place of refuge and safety. And I think we can learn a lot of lessons from looking at the CMEs, and particularly in the circles that we're in, because of the fact that the CMEs, the people who had formed the CME Church, many of these individuals decided to work alongside to stay at least in the Southern Methodist Church because they thought that they'd be able to work together. They thought things would, they'd be able to work alongside and really live as brothers and sisters in Christ. But then it became clear during this Reconstruction period as all of the violence became pervasive and the number of challenges came about that wasn't going to work because the Southern Methodists were telling Black Georgians and Blacks throughout the South, don't get involved in politics. You just let white individuals handle what's going on. Ignore the fact that there's a tremendous amount of violence targeting your communities. That the apprentice system, which would take Black children and apprentice them off to white individuals to work as house servants or field laborers, that we're going to institute those kind of things. Don't pay attention to that. Just let us handle what's going on. And so for Black leaders like Isaac Anderson and other Black ministers, because of their position of recognition within their communities and outside of their communities as ministers, that gave them the ability to serve as a refuge. The churches served as a refuge for their parishioners. And so when things were so difficult and challenging for a lot of the Black Methodists, and a number of them decided that they would establish a new denomination, and that would be the CME Church. Okay, so, all right. Again, that's one of the things that you see here, and so particularly in Georgia, I just want to show you real quick little map here, a little graph here. It just shows you how significant in terms of the Black Methodist church affiliation was in Georgia. It was pretty significant. And in all of the southern states, the CME Church would have one of its largest presence would be in Georgia. But again, it speaks to the importance of the Black church serving as a refuge. And for Isaac Anderson, he eventually would have to leave the state of Georgia because of the fact that legislation is passed that essentially would put him on the chain gang if he remained, because he was encouraging Black individuals to leave Georgia. It was just so horrendous here. So that would be the fate of Isaac Anderson. The other individual who would be a significant Black Methodist leader, Tunis Campbell Sr., he would be placed on the chain gang by 1876. He was placed on the chain gang for questionable charges, and he was a very well-respected AME Zion minister and leader. And then you have Henry McNeil Turner, of course, would remain very vocal. But Turner eventually would become one of the talk about Black immigration to places like Africa because of the fact of the conditions of what was going on. But either way, you see the church and these church leaders being very involved in what's going on in the community, in the Black community. Now, I'm not saying that we all need to get up and go to Africa, but I think that there are a lot of lessons that we can learn and a lot of important sort of things that we can glean from this period in history. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Carl so that he can talk a little bit, and then I think we'll have time for questions. Mm-hmm. All right.
Thank you, Alicia. All right. It's been my dream to work with Alicia for a number of years. I attended a seminar of yours at General Assembly a few years ago, and that was so good. And so give me a chance to get the technology straight here. Okay. Yeah, I'll just pull out, okay. All right, see if this works. If it doesn't. Oh, hallelujah. Oh, Lord, help me speak in English. Okay. All right. Okay. So Alicia has covered I guess, talking about political involvement. I think I want to take it from the perspective of cultural involvement of the Black church. I think we've done it's a remarkable history, and I'm almost tempted to show this thing about kind of some of the developments in the Black church in the 19th century. Can anybody tell me the name of the largest Black denomination in the 19th century? I think we'll do that. We'll see. Come on, largest Black denomination in the 19th century. Anybody know the name of it?
African Methodist Episcopal?
Nope, it's one of the large ones, but not really. Hang on, let me unsplit the screen here. Okay, yeah. All right, let me show it to you real quick, and then we'll get into the thing. And it gives you some background as to where the CME came from. All right, so we start off with you remember what was the name of the church? What was the name of the church where the AME church started? Huh? Bethel? That was the name of the church they founded, but what was the church that they left? It was a Methodist Episcopal Church. You know the name of it? It was St. George's Methodist Episcopal Church in Philadelphia. It is there to this day, right next to the Ben Franklin Bridge, right there. That's where Richard Allen and Absalom Jones were ejected from the service for praying they were supposed to go up to the balcony, which had just been finished, but the prayer was going on. They knelt there and prayed, and they said, "We'll go up there. Let's let us finish praying." And they wouldn't let them. They threw them out. They said, "Enough is enough," because they had been treated so shabbily up to that point. Okay. All right. So we have so the very first black denomination in the country, the oldest, is the Union Church of African Members. I can give you some more details on it, but we don't have a whole lot of time right now. But anyway, that was the oldest. Now the AME is the oldest existing. Okay. But the Union Church of African Members was the oldest. And then, of course, we have our old Methodist Episcopal Church, right? That was, St. George's Methodist Episcopal Church. So what happened was that eventually there was a split in this church. The Methodist Episcopals, they ended up splitting, and they became, this is after the incident, this is after Richard Allen and Absalom Jones left and started the AME Church and AME Zion in New York. Him. Okay, all right. So later on, the Methodist Episcopal Church split into the Methodist Protestant Church and the Methodist Episcopal Church. Most of the black members in the Methodist Episcopal Church who remained there, not all who left, not all left and became part of the AME Church. But those who remained, most of those who remained, went to the Methodist Protestant Church. A few blacks remained in the Methodist Episcopal Church, right? But eventually the Methodist Protestant Church started acting funny and treating blacks very shabbily. You see, in the 19th century, there were church splits over theology. But in the 19th century, it was church splits over side B of theology. In the 20th century, it's side A. Side B is the ethics. They were treating their members with shabbily, very shabbily. All right. So eventually the blacks said enough is enough, and they pulled out, and there was a split, and so the Methodists, it became the First Colored Methodist Protestant Church, all right? So that became another black denomination, all right? But the Union Church of African Members, there was a group that split off from that, and they became the Union African Methodist Episcopal Church, okay? Union American Methodist Episcopal Church. Now, what was left of the Union Church of African Members and the First Colored Methodist Protestant Church, they merged to form the largest black denomination in the 19th century, the African Union First Colored Methodist Protestant Church of the United All right? This is a wonderful thing. This is a wonderful piece of news. The African Union First Colored Methodist Protestant Church of the United States of America and elsewhere. That's the whole name of it. Okay. And they were bigger than the AMEs and the AME Zions put together at the time. They were huge. They had congregational church government, kind of acted like the Baptists, rather than the Presbyterians or the Episcopalians. And so there they were, all right? But it didn't last for that long, because you come to the time after the Reconstruction, when you have the end of the Reconstruction brings in the reestablishment of white supremacy through terrorism and all the rest of that, the KKK, and all these stresses and everything. And so what happened, these churches began to come under a lot of pressure, and they were seeking connection and protection. And so a lot of the churches in that denomination left and joined the African Methodist Episcopal Church and the AME Zion Church, okay? So that's what happened. And then later on, what was left of the African Union First Colored Methodist Protestant Church in the United States of America and elsewhere, what was left of it became the African Union Methodist Protestant Church. And today, that's what's left of all of that. Their headquarters is in Norristown, Pennsylvania, and the other church, the Union American Methodist Episcopal Church, is their headquarters in Delaware. So anyway, so somebody comes to you and asks you what's the largest black denomination in the 19th century, you can tell them that. Of course, you remember the name, right? Okay. Okay, I'm going to do some sweatshirts with that on it. Okay. Well, how many of you know about my thing about approaches to theology? You look at what is theology anyway? Anybody know how I define it? I define it as the application of God's word by persons in every area of life. All right. Some people think of theology as the study of God. Well, yes, it is that, but I have a broader definition. So, study of God is a part of theology. And there are two, you can approach theology from two perspectives, okay? And this is one of the things we have to understand. We still look at church history and all that. We have to understand the theology behind it. You can approach church history from two perspectives. You can approach it from the perspective of epistemology, that is, how do you know what you know, right? That's epistemology, right? Jesus loves me, this I know. What's the epistemological base? Right, okay, all right. So epistemology, dealing with what you know. So epistemological theology concerns itself with what we should know about God. You got it? All right, but there's another side of theology, not so much what we should know about God, but how we should obey God. You got it? All right, so you got both, right? Now I can give you some quizzes and all that, and tell you when the Bible comes at us, you know, which side is the Bible oriented toward, epistemology or ethics? Side A, side B. Come on, Bible is primarily a side B book, isn't it? Propositions versus narratives, side A, side B. Narratives, side B book, right? Okay. I'm not rejecting the Reformed theology we got. I'm saying it's great, but we got to remember there's another side to it. All right, and also you can do theology from a cognitive perspective, that is involving conceptual knowledge, or you can do theology from an intuitive base, and that is perceptual knowledge. If you listen to the oral tradition, you know what I mean by the oral tradition of the black church, right? How many don't know what I'm talking about if I talk about the oral tradition? Okay, so y'all know the oral tradition, right? Okay. Well, I'm going to demonstrate it to you, okay? Imagine I'm in church, I'm giving my testimony. I stand up, and I'm going to start something, you finish it. I say, first, who is? Now, how did y'all know that? Okay. Jesus is a bridge. He's a bright. He's the rose. All right. One Friday they put him in the grave, but early Sunday morning he got up with. Okay, that's the oral tradition. You hear it all over the place. And when you hear the oral tradition, you hear an intuitive theology, don't you? And you hear, you hear this ethical thing. I mean, somebody can come I can tell you that God is faithful and He'll never betray His covenant promises and all that. I can tell you that, and you can understand it. But I come along and tell you that God has brought me from a mighty long way. That's the same thing, isn't it? But this is narratival. You got it? I can tell my story, tell you how God's faithful, or I can tell you conceptually. You got it? Okay. All right. So, I have something I call the window of theology, all right? All right, so 4 panes of the window, that crossbar in the middle is fuzzy because the idea is that these things aren't hard, there aren't hard boundaries between them. But the top two would be epistemological, what we know about God. The bottom two, ethical. The left two would be cognitive. The right two would be intuitive. Okay? All right, so there you go. So if you look at historic Western theology, or European theology is in the upper left-hand quadrant. Now, remember what our brother Irwin said this morning, about Reformed theology. The Reformed theology is probably the best theology out there on the upper left-hand quadrant. We got that thing sewed up, We got that thing down pat. However, if you look at historic Southern African American theology, there it is. It's too intuitive and ethical. Come on. I'm gonna trust in the Lord. Right? Now. What's one of the verses? I'm gonna treat everybody right. Now, if we were coming up in a Western context, you see, we would say, I will agree to the Westminster Confession of Faith. All right, so you catch my drift, right? All right. So now here's an interesting thing, and Alicia kind of alluded to it. There is a Northern African American theology that was also ethical but more cognitive. Okay. All right. Now I don't want to. Oh, okay, we got a little time here. Okay, so let me go through a couple of things here. The Southern theology was a theology of suffering. You got it? You hear this in the church all the time, right? Now, the reason that you hear this in the church all over the country, even in the North, is because of the great migrations that happened in the 20th century, right? People came north, and then they brought their churches with them, right? All right. So the vast majority of African American churches, traditional African American churches, are Southern type. They have a Southern orientation. Okay, so this was a theology of suffering in the Exodus paradigm. You know what I'm talking about. It's all about the Exodus. Go down, Moses, way down in Egypt's land. You hear this all the time, right? All right. And it was concerned about things like survival, refuge. In traditional black church, how do they refer to the church? They refer to it as the ark of safety. You ever hear that? The refuge, resistance to oppression, those kind of things. They didn't resist necessarily physically, but they resisted in terms of the way they would sing their songs, like, heaven, heaven. Everybody talking about heaven ain't going to heaven, that kind of thing. So, and then the Northern church had not so much a theology of suffering, but a theology of empowerment, okay? Because in the North, the issue was marginalization rather than suffering. Does that make sense? And so this theology was in the exilic paradigm. It was in the North where people began to develop a consciousness that they were a part of a group of people that were exiled from their homeland. They began to talk about the African diaspora. They began to think about why are they here. Their whole meaning of existence here has something to do with the African diaspora. And believe it or not, a lot of our forefathers, as they started thinking through the significance of their presence here in this country, they began to come to the conclusion that they are here. The reason they are here is so that they can carry the gospel of Jesus Christ to the rest of the African diaspora. And out of that came a great missions movement, which we don't have time to talk about today. It concerned itself with things like dignity, identity, and significance. That should sound familiar. So now both the Southern theology and the Northern theology had all the salvific stuff in it, salvation by grace through faith, Jesus Christ, and all that. But the theme, the package, the orientation of the theology came in those two things, suffering and empowerment. And after the Civil War, of course, what began to happen was that, of course, the abolition of slavery just really set the stage for some astounding progress made by African Americans in a lot of areas. You heard Alicia talking about blacks sitting in the Georgia State Legislature. We had senators and all the lieutenant governors, all that. It's happening right after the Civil War, during the Reconstruction. But what happened, therefore, though, was that when that began to happen, the Southern church began to think, okay, we are coming out of Egypt. We're coming out of Egypt. And so they began to adopt the Northern theology of empowerment. See? And so you go from one to two black theologies to one for a while. And so what began to develop was a kind of a, and by the way, let me say this, a lot of people from the Southern church began to get involved in this missions movement that was happening out of the North, okay? It was a big deal. Well, looked pretty good. We had a great oral tradition coming along. Things were going along pretty well. But then we have three great traumas in the 19th century between 1875 and 1900, which changed everything. The first trauma was the end of the Reconstruction in the South. We've heard about, Alicia told us about that, when when the federal troops were removed, who were enforcing the 14th, 15th amendments. There was the rise of Jim Crow, all that, black codes. Then there was the Industrial Revolution in the North, okay? The Industrial Revolution in the North, which brought about the whole need. You had a lot of European immigration coming in, and we needed to Americanize all these foreigners, right? So this is where you begin to see the melting pot concept emerge. But of course, unfortunately, the melting pot concept was based on a Eurocentric ideal, a Eurocentric Protestant ideal. Let's put it that way. So you might be from Europe, but if you were a Catholic, you had a hard way to go, But eventually, the Europeans kind of were able to assimilate and all the rest of that. But the rest of us who couldn't assimilate because of visibility issues, we kind of burned, right? So okay, all right. So you have that. So that was a trauma, and of course the industrialists didn't want to have a black labor force because the people who had all the skills, all the trade skills were the former slaves, weren't they? But they didn't want to have that, so they encouraged European immigration. Out of that came white-only trade unions. And so blacks were squeezed out of the skilled labor force, squeezed out of mainstream American life. So that was the second trauma. The end of the Reconstruction, the end of the Industrial Revolution, and finally the consolidation of colonialism in West Africa. Just let me say just two sentences about that. There was an extensive black missions movement on the continent of Africa, coming from the United States and the Caribbean. There's a whole course we could teach on this. But when the Industrial Revolution hit Europe, suddenly they needed all these raw materials, right? Hello. And by that time we had the ocean-going steamship, and so they could easily get down to Africa and do whatever. And all of a sudden now the Europeans get serious about colonization, because that's where the resources are. And of course, the Europeans started fighting each other over it, the Spanish against the French, against the Portuguese. And there was a big mess until German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck in 1884 and 85 called a meeting in Berlin and had all the colonial powers come together, and they carved up sub-Saharan Africa. Not one African was present at that meeting. And so they went on and did what they wanted to do, and they persecuted, marginalized, and expelled all the black missionaries and put pressure on all the missions agencies to say, we don't want any black missionaries in Africa anymore. And of course, they would tell the African Americans who wanted to go on the mission field, they say, well, the Africans won't accept you. When the Africans say, where are the African Americans? They say, African Americans don't care about you. And and I know people to this day who have experienced that. All right, so those are the three great traumas: the end of the Reconstruction, the effects of the Industrial Revolution, and the decimation of the missions movement. And as a matter of fact, what happened to the black church, missions, the black church went into missions amnesia, missions coma. There was no missions consciousness on the part of the black church until later on a new type of black church comes forth, the black evangelical church. And that began the reawakening, the call to missions, or the interest in missions. All right, so before I end this, I'll just go over a couple of things. What effect did these three great traumas have on the African American church in the North? Okay. Well, what happened was, because the connection between the African church and the African American church was severed, the theology of the whole exilic theological paradigm began to degenerate. All right, and what was left of the Northern African American theological tradition was undermined by dangerous humanistic heresies that began to come into some of the theological institutions. Now remember, in the North, African Americans had access to formal theological education. In the South, they didn't. And so what began to happen, I call these humanistic heresies, other people call it liberalism. I don't think what they brought in there was worthy of the term liberal. Okay, so it's like this. You know how this stuff works. Well, we know that Jesus didn't rise from the dead in history. We know that, but we believe it anyway because it makes us feel good. To that I say, well, I know of other ways to feel good. You know. You understand what I'm saying? I mean, that doesn't take any meditation. You know, all I got to do is sniff. Okay, no, don't go out here thinking I'm telling y'all to use the drugs and all that. Okay, but what began to happen is that these humanistic heresies, where the Bible is no longer the Word of God and all the rest of that, it just gutted the vitality out of the Northern theology. And the churches that ran on that Northern theology degenerated into social service agencies and political bases. They were still called churches, but they engaged the community, but no longer theologically, sociologically. Does that make sense to you? Okay. All right. Now, in the South, what began to happen was that with the reestablishment of white supremacy, it became dangerous for blacks in the South to begin to say, hey, I am somebody, and all the rest of that, because you'd be accused of being an uppity N-word, right? And so if you begin to say those kind of things, in the wrong place, in the wrong part of the quilt, as we heard this morning in the South, right? Where would you be in about 45 minutes? Hanging from a tree. That's right. That's where you'd be. And so what began to happen then in the North, the older generation stopped telling the younger generation about all this, and the theology, the Southern church drifted away, or shall I say, just gave up on the Northern theology, or the theology of empowerment, and reverted to the theology of suffering. And what began to happen then is that in some ways the church became a pacifying institution, helping black folks make it another week under racism. And in general, I say the church was caught off guard by these traumas, and the missions consciousness of the church is obliterated. The core concerns of dignity, identity, and significance were abandoned. Now, those are very important. Think about that. In any group of minority people or subdominant people in a society, what tends to happen is that the dominant culture tends to step on your sense of dignity, identity, and significance. And so you have to have another way to make that up. Well, with the church no longer addressing that, guess what? People said, we need to address that anyway. So there was I call a theological vacuum in terms of dignity, identity, and significance. And wherever you have a vacuum, you have what? Attempts to fill the vacuum, right? So it was right after the demise of Northern theology. The Northern theology, the vitality was cut out from under it. The Southern church abandoned the theology of empowerment. And so at that point, other people started trying to come up with alternative theologies of empowerment. You have the rise of a whole bunch of black Jewish sects back in those days, early 20th century. You had Marcus Garvey trying to do this, but of course he had a shaky theological basis. Then halfway through the century, another attempt was with black nationalism. They're trying to fill the theological vacuum. It didn't catch on too well, but later on, you had let's put it this way. You had black Islamic sects that came along. Remember this? And they had an alternative theology empowerment. It was wacky. If you ever read some of the stuff that Elijah Muhammad put out, it's weird, but at least it answers the questions, right? What causes tornadoes? Right? Trailer parks. You know that. And why? Why did the hurricane? What causes hurricanes? It's palm trees, of course. You know that. So that kind of reasoning came in, and they began to. So it was stupid answers, but they did answer the questions. Now, why do white folks act like this? Oh, because the white man's the devil. Oh, Oh. You know, you got me? You got me? Okay, because the church wasn't on the scene engaging those questions. We were too busy surviving. All right. And then you had ideologies of empowerment. Du Bois, remember? Black solidarity through education. You had the Harlem Renaissance that came along, trying to speak out against injustice and everything through the creative arts that lasted for 20 years or so. Like I said, black nationalism, but it didn't catch on. But the black consciousness movement caught on. And by the way, going back to the alternative theologies of empowerment, the Nation of Islam is not our greatest challenge today. What is, theologically speaking? Come on. The Hebrew Israelites, right? It's the same issue. Because why are the Hebrew Israelites gaining a lot of attention? I'll tell you why. Because they are addressing the core concerns of dignity, identity, and significance. Does the Bible address those core concerns? Yes. You bet your bippy it does. But does the church in America address those concerns? No. So I think that's a lesson we need to learn. Look, back in the day, before the great traumas, you couldn't find an African American who wasn't at least influenced by the church, if not a Christian. Why? Because the black church in the 19th century addressed the cultural core concerns of dignity, identity, and significance. And as a matter of fact, the growth of the black church in the 19th century, between 1870 and 1910, is one of the greatest, if not the greatest example of church growth in the history of the church. If you want to get the attention of any people group, you address their cultural core concerns theologically, and you'll get it. And when the church dropped out from addressing those things, then other people try to rush in to do it. And by the way, I'll just make a long story short. The 20th century, the story of the 20th century, African American culture can be told in terms of failed attempts to fill the theological vacuum with alternative theologies and ideologies. It failed. And that leaves the church, it leaves us once more in the prime position. If we would only read our Bibles and do application and address these core concerns, just maybe we might see another great move toward Christ. So I'll end it at that. We can talk about the great migrations and all that, but I just want to say that in the 19th century, you had a bunch of guys. Okay, just let me say this. I wish I had known this back in the days of the 60s. By the way, yeah, I lived through the 60s. I remember. I got the gray hair to prove it. Okay. All these ideas, black is beautiful and all that stuff, and all the foundational truths of the black consciousness movement were the products of African American theology in the 19th century. Okay? These are the things that came out of the Northern theology. Okay, case in point. What's the oldest, the first black denomination? Come on, I just showed it to you. The something Church of African Members. What was it? Union Church. No, not that was the biggest. The Union Church of African Members, right? I thought they were Negroes. This is America. Why do they call themselves African? Okay, well now, what's the oldest existing black denomination? AME. What does the A stand for? How didn't they call it the Negro Methodist Episcopal? What was the name of the second oldest? AME Zion. What does A stand for? What's the name of the first black parachurch organization? Anybody know? The Free Africa Society, founded in Philadelphia in 18 something or other. It'll come back to me. All right? And it was out of the Free Africa Society that gave birth to Bethel AME Church. All right? 1886 or something like that. Anyway, the date slips me. But why do they call themselves African? Because they were dealing with issues of identity. We were being called Negroes, and they said, we reject that. But that's not what God created us to be. He created us to be Africans. And that's what they were dealing with. Talking about empowerment and all the rest of that. economic development, and all these things were part of the Free Africa Society, and they had chapters all over the place. So all that had been lost, so these Johnny-come-latelys in the 20th century, thinking that they had something that nobody else had, well, hey, where'd you get that from? So the church, in its history in the 19th century, really addressed the cultural core concerns, and nowadays with the shipwreck of we today are in a major cultural crisis among African Americans, and we are in a major identity crisis. I can go into details about that, but let's suffice it to say we're in serious trouble. And is there a voice? I think the voice will come as we read the Word of God with these concerns in mind, and you'll be surprised the kind of things that the Bible does. So the thing we can learn from history is this. We did it once, and we can do it again. And I'll end it at that. Okay.
So Doctor, you saying, Doctor, we're gonna be all right?
Oh, sorry, no kissing. We went to where is she? The seminar on sexual misconduct. We were told not to kiss. Anyway, come on, Alicia. We're just opening up for questions. So. Any questions?
Name of your book?
It's The Recovered Life of Isaac Anderson. So the idea behind it is that his story is a story that has not been told, that's been lost, so anyway, that's the title of the book. And one of the things I was thinking about, and I wanted to mention in terms of sort of things that we can do in terms of sort of how we can move forward. This is me putting my historian hat on, is telling our stories to our families. I mean, I think one of the things that is just so sad is that people have dealt with so much pain and trauma. Oftentimes they just repress those things and don't talk about it. And I wouldn't say to put that pain on the next generation, but I would say to tell about those stories and tell how God brought you through that. And see, that's one of the things I think that's so powerful about the Black church. And one of the things I'm talking about in my book is that was what the church was. So when people, yes, they came out of slavery and they could talk about, okay, it was sort of a shared understanding, but then when they were day-to-day challenges, people understood. It was like there's a wonderful poem by A.B. Spellman. It's called When Black People Are. And one of my favorite lines of it is that he says that Black people, we share we speak back and forth like borrowed breath. And so I think in many ways that is what the Black church was. It serves as that kind of environment. And I think when we don't tell those stories about our own family history or our own challenges, we just do a disservice to the next generation. And God talks about in His Word about how we remember the stones of remembrance, how we remember how He brought us through. And when we don't tell those stories, even those hard things, I mean, we're just sort of putting that to the side, and I think we're doing a big disservice. So that's one of the things I would say that I think is so important for us to do, and that's one of the things that I try to sort of recapture in the book project. So.
Amen.
You can pick the next person.
In the back.
This is a comment, but I appreciate hearing you say to remember, and I appreciate you sharing the story. I just think about my own upbringing, and I've never heard any of this. So I am half African, half American, born in Africa. I came here when I was 5. My mom chose to put me in private schools my whole life. And I have always wondered about the conflict between like Black Americans and like Africans, and I've never understood that tension in myself. And like over the years coming to LDR has like addressed it, like hearing this concept that like when like other people that are minorities come to the U.S., like identifying with minorities as dominant culture, like hearing that, but then even hearing like this call to like the African movement and theology and like being a person that cares about missions but not understanding why Black people don't go, but then hearing that that's like a history that wasn't told, that like Blacks were going first. And I know that that is true because when I think about places in Africa where they have like established free towns and like this movement of like Africans going back, it's always been told in this like weird like dashiki back to the future kind of thing, but the theology of it and like God's moving hand in it was never told to me. And I appreciate you saying that it's so important to share our histories because this has been very eye-opening, and it's like putting a lot of pieces together.
And one of the things I should say, and that I didn't say in the presentation is, you know, the AMEs, AME Zions, and CMEs did not get along at all. And there is a lot of tension, especially between the AMEs and the CMEs. And so they called the CMEs the bootleg church, the slave church. And part of it is because one of the first leaders, one of the first bishops, his name is Lucius Hosley. He initially was like, I mean, if you read his stuff, it's like, it makes you cringe because he's like, you know, we need to be under the tutelage of the white people because they're the sort of superior race. So, but then what happens is that he becomes almost totally disaffected. So by 1899, he's talking about we need to have an all-black state where white people really don't come in. They have to have permission to come in. And so you see him move to the other sort of extreme about that, but it's because you have that tension within these free people immediately following emancipation. So it's not as if Black people, we all got along and we're singing Kumbaya together.
And the CMEs, you know, remember I said most of the African Americans went over with the Methodist Protestant Church. I said a few stayed in the Methodist Episcopal Church. The Blacks who stayed in there comes down to 1870. And they were allowed, the African Americans finally, I guess they must have seen with all the conflict and everything, the Methodist Episcopal, which was now the Southern Church, the Southern Methodist Episcopal, or whatever it was called, but they allowed the Blacks to form their own denomination, and that became the CME.
Yeah, but you know what? I would argue that, because that's one of the things, it's a big historical debate, so I thought put my foot in it. But the big debate is within historical circles is that the CMEs were sort of pushed out.
Yeah, they were allowed to leave.
I would say no. I would argue that no, they weren't allowed. They wanted out. Oh, okay. And they wanted to have their own church space because they wanted to be able to worship and not, I mean, because they're dealing with it day to day. So if you're dealing with day to day where people are lynching folks, you can't carry a gun to protect yourself. You can't, but other people can. You have a white militia that is established, but a Black militia can't be established.
Right.
I mean, all these things going on, and people are telling you, well, don't get involved in politics. Just go to church. Just listen to what the leadership's doing. We got it covered. Well, they're like, no, we got to have our own place. And so that's why I argue that, and it's a big debate within circles, but I argue that no, they wanted out.
I like that story better. Okay, all right. Yes.
Any thoughts on, I mean, you know, just appreciate your chart. African Americans have a long history in the AME church, and I grew up in a Baptist tradition, you know, a large population of African Americans. Now in a PCA church, any thoughts historically on why that played out, or you know, where there's such a large, small percentage of African Americans more in the Presbyterian type reform circle? I mean, you know, from slavery to now, how did we get to that?
Well, let me take a stab at that. First of all I won't say all because I'll say most of the ones that I have read or heard about, most of the African American theologians or thinkers that I read about were basically, most of them were Reformed anyway. They subscribed to either the Westminster Confession or the Baptist Convention, the Philadelphia Confession of the Philadelphia Confession was just like the Westminster except about baptism, okay? And all the most of the people who did catechizing of African Americans were Reformed. So there was this Reformed underpinning, you know, of African American theology. The Presbyterians, though, okay, two things. All right, we get into some of our own internal conflicts, all right, and some of us who, you know, some African Americans were freed, you know, before slavery ended. And a lot of these were people who bought their own freedom, who escaped, or who were freed by their masters because they were the offspring of their masters. That makes sense? And you suddenly see, look at the history of the 19th century, you see a lot of African Americans who were high achievers were tended to be light complected. It has nothing to do with the percentage of white blood. It's just that they had a 30 or 40 year head start on the rest of their brother in freedom. Does that make sense? So, you know, Fisk University was started to educate mulattoes, you know, the offspring of slave masters. And so that's the first. So what happened then is that you know how we're all sinners, right? So some of us began to think we began to imitate the dominant culture, which was racist, right? So we began to imitate racism among ourselves. We got into colorism. Hello?
Yes.
Yeah, come on. This is dirty laundry, but you know, this is true, right? And so what began to happen is that those of us who wanted to be more a part of the dominant or be like the dominant culture, we were attracted to churches like Presbyterian, Episcopal, Congregational. Does that make sense? And so these churches tend to be kind of high churches, quote unquote high churches. They disregarded historic black culture. You know, you know how we do. They did all the oral tradition and all that stuff was out. And so Presbyterianism, historically among black folks, has the reputation of being civity witty, you know, right? As a matter of fact, if you look at all the Presbyterian churches in America, the PCA is the most diverse, believe it or not. That's not saying a whole lot. But if you look at the black churches within the PCA, they are much more culturally black than the black churches in the PCUSA. PCUSA looks down on us. They say, "Oh, you guys," you know. But because the PCA is a newer denomination, and black churches came along after those days of when we were into colorism. Some of us still are there, but I'm saying that it hasn't, you know, Presbyterianism has not been all that attractive, historically speaking, as you know, as it could be. It's much more attractive today, but we got history to do with it. So that's the crack I take at it.
You talked about Isaac Anderson's family background.
Oh, yes.
Isaac Anderson.
Yeah, so the thing that's interesting about Isaac Anderson and how it's a counter narrative because the story about blacks in Georgia that is most, and during the Reconstruction period, is that black individuals acquiesced to their former masters. And you see this sort of all throughout a lot of the writing about Georgia history. And so the thing that Isaac Anderson and why he's such a standout person in terms of looking at this period and how he challenges that narrative is because of the fact that Isaac Anderson's father was white. And he was also his master. And so you see him challenging the political system. But again, things are just so oppressive in Georgia, and they're doing everything they can. But it's not because they acquiesce to white leadership. It's because the federal government's gone, so they have no one to back them up. They're being targeted. It's just the Freedmen's Bureau's gone, so they have really no recourse. And so one of the things I argue, and I think it's so important to think about, sort of as thing I want to mention too about sort of as we think about this topic is that the church served as a safe space, and then for folks in Georgia, when the environment was not safe, they picked up and left because they had to go somewhere so they could survive. But the thing I guess I keep thinking about in this project is just, and how it relates to this topic, is that it's so important for our churches to be safe spaces, for us to have people in our lives that are safe spaces and refuges, a place of refuge for us, because it can be so debilitating, the day in and day out. And I think that is how this story of what happens during Reconstruction so speaks to what's going on today. And Henry Louis Gates talks about that in his documentary, just how we have not learned those lessons and how they've come back again. Because of course with President Obama's election, a lot of people thought, oh, things are going to be so much better, and then we just see this whole sort of backlash. And so in many ways it's very similar in a number of respects to this period. So.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I think a lot of that backlash was due to, let's put it this way, I like the idea of having a black president. I'll just say it like it is. But I think some of his policies got under people's skins, and I don't think that had a whole lot to do with race. It had to do with some other things. But part of that, this thing that we see is that too. So, Sam?
Regarding the issue of why there's not as many black people among Presbyterian and Reformed circles as there are other places. I did on, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I did a paper on evangelization of slaves. I learned that it was really the Methodist Church, just went crazy with evangelizing slaves, late 1700s and early 1800s.
Well, one of the reasons was because they had an anti-slavery stance. So did the Baptists. Presbyterians generally favored slavery, with the exception of the Scottish Presbyterians, by the way. You ought to check out their history. They refused to have anything to do with slavery. So yeah, and that had a lot to do with which goes back to the thing that the American Presbyterians, on the most part, were out of balance. They were strong on side A, weak on side B, and that's where all their moral failures were. That's how you can explain the moral failure of Jonathan Edwards, the moral failure of George Whitefield, and all the rest of it. They were disasters on the ethical side. So anyway, that was one of the problems. That's one of the problems of the imbalance. And that's why that's one of the reasons why we have this going on right now. Is that we have to really fully develop that side B thing. What does it look like on side B?
Do you have any books on the decimation of the Black Missions Movement? Any books of resources?
You're about the 10th person has asked me that. I got a lot of notes, and I'll work on the book. I'm looking for somebody else has to have written on this, and I haven't found it yet. But I see bits and pieces here and there. But I did do a course at Reformed Theological Seminary on all that, so if you want to check it out, check this out. There you go.
In the very first one.
Yeah, okay. Time's up.
Just last question about why African Americans are one of those denominations. Did you mention about standards for clergy?
Oh, yeah, well, yeah, not to me. Of course, Presbyterians required all the seminary education and all that, And of course, most of the seminaries were closed to blacks, right? So that was another issue. I kind of let that. I think that was obvious, but yeah, it's good to mention it though. Sure. Elisa, it's a pleasure.
Pleasure
Let's do this
here.
some more.